All right, so the last thing that that Bergson said in his essay was that he thinks that there is uh, basically one mental fact, one aspect of our mental lives, which is in fact delineated in the brain. He asks, he says, is it, obviously movement is something that the brain and the nervous system does. He says he doesn't think it's perception. He doesn't go into why he doesn't think that, but he says you have to refer to his book Matter and Memory to find that out. And he says, is it the faculty of willing? Is this it? He says no. He says the body carries out voluntary movements by means of certain mechanisms set up in the nervous system. Da 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 da. And then I'm going to skip that part. I read it already. And he says that the brain, in his view, is a sort of um, commutator by which a given external stimulus can be put in communication with any motor disposition, whatever. So basically, it translates between perception and action. But beside the or besides the organs of movement and the organ of choice, so besides motor movements and willing, uh, which we was talking about before, there is something of a different kind. So he's making a difference. He says, I think that he's saying that between movement and choice, there is a difference of degree. But he says, beside them, there is something of a different kind. There's choice itself. Besides the organs of choice and movement, there is choice itself. And he says, so that's something different. That's something of the soul, not in the that's not part of our mental life, which is delineated in the brain or the nervous system. He says, lastly, and this is the most important point. He says, lastly, is it the faculty of thinking? When we think, it is seldom that we are not. He says, when we think, it is seldom that we are not talking inwardly. We are, yeah, we are outlining or preparing. If we are not actually making the articulate movements by which our thought is expressed, and all these must be already delineated in the brain. But right, so he says what he says. I'll say it again because this is an important part for his view in general. Let me set my timer. I always forget to set the timer. Sorry. Okay. He says, lastly, is the faculty of thinking. He says, when we think, it is seldom that we are not talking inwardly. We are outlining or preparing, if we are not actually making, the articulate movements by which our thought is expressed. And all of these movements must be already delineated in the brain. But the cerebral mechanism of thought is not, in my view, limited to this. Besides these internal movements of articulation, which are moreover not indispensable, there is something much more subtle which is essential. I mean those nascent, or we call it virtual, I mean those nascent movements which translate symbolically the thousand successive directions of thought. Remember that real, concrete, living thought is, so he's talking about thought here, so this is, for anyone interested in thought, the nature of thought, this is his opinion. Remember that real, concrete, living thought is something of which psychologists have so far told us very little, because it is very ill adapted to internal observation. What is usually studied under this head is not so much thought itself as an artificial imitation of it, obtained by putting together, externally separated, so by putting together images and ideas. But with images, and even with ideas, you can no more reconstitute thinking than with positions you can make movement. So if I give you a bunch of little dots, you can't, you'll never, if I make a bunch of immobilities, a bunch of pictures, you'll never be able to reconstitute real movement. Same thing with thought. Just by taking together a bunch of images and ideas, you're not going to actually give us thought. He says why. The idea Now, the idea is actually a stopping of thought. The idea arises when the thinking, instead of continuing its own train, makes a pause and is reflected back on itself. So there's a difference between real thought and reflection for him. Reflection is only a halt in thought. So he says, it is like the heat that produces itself in the projectile which encounters an obstacle. Okay? But it was no more part of our thought whilst we were thinking. The idea was no more a part of our thought whilst we were thinking than the heat was to be found in the projectile before the stop. So the idea is just like we stop and we reflect, and then the heat builds up, and that so it's no more a part of the the uh, the idea was no more a part of our thought whilst we were thinking than the heat was to be found in the projectile before the stop. Try, for example, try, this is challenging the reader, is try, for example, by piecing together the ideas heat, production, and projectile. And so we have these three elements, right? These three external elements. We have heat, production, and the projectile, okay? And intercalating the ideas, so that means connecting the ideas, uh, inwardness and reflection expressed in the words in and itself. So there's these two ideas which are expressed in the words in and itself. Try by taking heat, production, projectile, and intercalating the ideas inwardness and reflection expressed in the words in and in itself, right? This is tough to follow, but try to take all these different ideas and reconstitute the thought I just expressed in the sentence, heat, heat produces itself in the projectile. You will see that it is impossible that the thought translated by the sentence, heat produces itself in the projectile, you will see that it is impossible that the thought translated by the sentence is an indivisible movement. It's indivisible. As soon as you break it up, you can't put it back together again. It'll be an artificial reconstruction. As you will see, it is impossible that the thought translated, so the thought which is translated by the sentence, is an indivisible movement, and that the ideas corresponding to each of the words are simply the images or concepts which would arise in the mind at each moment of the thinking, if the thinking halted. But it does not halt. Put aside, then, artificial reconstructions of thinking. Consider thinking itself. You will find directions rather than states. So put aside artificial reconstructions of thinking by piecing together the ideas and the images. And consider instead thinking itself. You will find not states, but directions. And you will see that thinking is essentially a continual and continuous change of inward direction, incessantly tending to translate itself by changes of outward direction. I mean by actions and gestures, capable of outlining in space and of expressing metaphorically, as it were, the comings and goings of the mind. Of these movements sketched out, or even simply prepared, nascent, we are most often unaware. These movements we are most often unaware of, because we have no interest in knowing them. But we have to notice them when we try to seize hold of our thought in order to grasp it all living and make it pass, still living, into the soul of another. So when we have to communicate the ideas we do. He says, again, he'll say, of these movements of thought, sketched out or even simply prepared, we are most often unaware because we have no interest in knowing them. But we have to notice them when we try to seize hold of our thought in order to grasp it all living and make it pass, still living, into the soul of another, like as I'm communicating with you. The words may then have been well chosen. The words may then have been well chosen. They will not convey the whole of what we wish to make them say if we do not succeed by the rhythm, by the punctuation, by the relative lengths of the sentences. So it doesn't matter how well you select words, how well the words are chosen to express what you want to say, but you won't convey the whole of what you want to make those words say if you do not succeed by the rhythm, by the punctuation, by the relative lengths of the sentences and parts of sentences, by a particular dancing of the sentence, in making the reader's mind, or the listener's mind in this case, by making the listener's mind continually guided by a series of nascent movements, describe a curve of thought and feeling analogous to that we ourselves describe. So I have to make the thought in its living movement come alive in you. in the same way that it comes alive in myself. So I have to express the thought in a way that's isomorphic with the thought itself, the rhythm and the continual flow. You remember Bergson is all about time and temporality and flow, which is opposed to physics, which cuts things up. You know, it makes everything the same. He thinks everything is heterogeneous and continual. Um, in this consists the whole art of writing. Okay, so I think we'll continue in the next video. It's going to be on the art of writing. I think this is cool because we've recently come upon in neuroscience an observation about mirror neurons, and so I think that this may give us a hint of what what Bergson would say about mirror neurons and what's going on. So stay tuned.